Hey, Michael.
Hey, what's up, Ragnar?
I'm doing great actually, and I just made a cup of coffee, and I'm getting ready for a podcast once
Excellent.
again.
Yeah,
What
I'm
about you?
just made myself a cup of cozy chamomile tea myself, just settling down, bunkering down a little bit, if you will. We got Hurricane Irma is bearing in
Yeah.
on Atlanta as we speak, so I'm just enjoying this little calm before the storm, if you will. I feel the electric energy running through me.
It's one of the few times where the calm before the storm is meant literally, I guess. Yeah. Dude, I'm a little worried about you. Like, is everything going all right over there?
Yeah,
Like, are you safe?
Oh yeah. We my partner Christina and I we really made sure everything was locked down, cleaned all the gutters out. The house is ready to go, and it's probably I think our thoughts should really be with most of the people in Florida right now because they're going to get it the worst. It's not going to be too bad up here. The thing I'm more worried about is they're saying the power might be out for 2, 3, maybe 4 days, and woof, oh man, imagine not being able to play video games for 3 days. Like
Oh
Jesus,
my.
I don't even want to think about that reality.
I was actually thinking like the last time I experienced a longer power outage was actually quite it turned out to be a quite cozy adventurous time. Like it had something really primal and really
Yeah.
get back to basics, and you get inventive with heating up water and starting your own fires
Oh
and all
yeah,
that kind of
yeah.
stuff. Like,
Well, and I got the candles ready, got alternative sources of light, and I picked out. I'm gonna reread. If the power goes out for a couple days, I'm gonna reread the Akira graphic novels. I have like the complete set of those, and it's like, all right, that'll definitely tide me over throughout any power outage.
see, that's perfect. Just gotta be prepared, and then, like, yeah, okay, please stay safe. But I mean, that's kind of the reason why we record now, like, because
Oh yeah.
if the power is out, then we can't record a podcast in a couple of days. Boom. So, what did we pick out for today? We should,
Yeah.
you know what? We should actually stop asking this because everybody already we had that before.
Oh,
Everybody
I guess
already
it's
knows we're.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
in the title. It's just, dear reader, dear listener, just look up and, oh yeah, I guess it's, Vagrant Story. All right, well
Yeah.
and this is, I think you're doing something on Vagrant
Yes.
Story just this moment?
Literally like 20 minutes ago, I was still working on a video on my channel on Vagrant Story in the Forgotten Gems series, which usually, it ties in very well with what we're doing with the podcast here. Like in this podcast, we talk about older games from our past, and Forgotten Gems is also about older games, but mostly some that in some way fell off the radar. But because Vagrant Story, which is a Japanese action RPG from 2000 that was released for the PlayStation 1. And Vagrant Story is kind of a very, I wouldn't even say complicated game, but it's a game you can talk a lot about, and there's a lot of granular stuff that doesn't fit in this short video format. And that's why I thought, you know what, Michael, let's extend on this a little bit in the podcast so we can just leisurely
We
explore
get
it a
to
little
do
bit
that
together.
long format discussion this way. Yeah, and I mean, my background with the game is I think I've always been a little bit more of a Japanese RPG fan than you. I think I'm more familiar with that subgenre. But
I mean, I
this
do have a little bit of experience, but you've been more the weeb type than me, I guess.
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, from the moment Final Fantasy 2 or 4, whichever you want to call it, came out on the Super
Right.
Nintendo, and I played that, like that ruined me for life. Like just I fell in love with Squaresoft games and Japanese RPGs, and yeah, and so this is how back in the day this game Vagrant Story we're talking about here is that this is just Squaresoft. They had not merged with Enix yet and become kind of this like monopolistic Japanese RPG company. Like they were still just Squaresoft, and they were kind of like riding high off of Final Fantasy VII, which had come out in '97, but like they had not quite ascended to the level of dominance yet. And I think part of that is almost kind of how Vagrant Story came to be, because Square, I think when they were still kind of like a mid-tier competitor, they were willing to take a risk on these more kind of like offbeat, mid-budget, Vagrant Story is not like a big AAA Final Fantasy style blockbuster action RPG. This is mid-tier, mid-budget that is more interested in like story and characterization
Yeah.
necessarily than like big spectacle.
I just already thought that it was a good idea to do this podcast because you already, without knowing, corrected something that I screwed up in my video script. I just realized because I did bad research, apparently. I talked about Square Enix releasing the game where it actually wasn't Square Enix at the time. So when people are watching the video, like, cross-platform, and they hear Squaresoft, they know it is correct because of this podcast. Isn't that a nice feeling?
Heck yeah. Hey, that's that. But this is exactly the depth of knowledge I think I'm bringing to this this endeavor.
Yeah.
But yeah. So anyway, Vagrant Story is in many ways like a departure. So that is another thing to keep in mind, is that you traditionally Squaresoft, the Japanese RPG you think of, it's turn-based. You have a party of a couple characters, you give them commands, you go back and forth with the enemy party, and then you win, you get experience and loot, and you get stronger. And Vagrant Story is very much a departure from that tradition. How would you describe it, Ragnar?
Well, I already said that is an action RPG, but usually when people think about action RPGs earlier, they might think of, for example, Diablo, where it's like mouse controlled, or sometimes like there are also versions for the PlayStation, but it's like direct hack and slash, basically. That's not Vagrant Story, but Vagrant Story kind of goes a middle way between a tactical and an action RPG, so it is controlled in real time. But okay, here's my assessment. I would call it a mixture between a tactical, an action role-playing game, and a DDR.
Yes, the rhythm element.
DDR meaning a Dance Dance Revolution, or rhythm games where you have to react to a certain rhythm pattern.
Yeah, you have to time your button inputs to the movement of your character. When your character is in a certain position, you hit the button and you get an extra attack added on, and that's called a chain. And so like that's basically you need to kind of figure out how to master this timing system in order to really beat tougher enemies. And so and that kind of combines with, you also have statistics and leveling, like strength, dexterity, that kind of stuff, and your armor and weapons can have different attributes, and all of these systems kind of like blend together in what is a very complex set of RPG systems.
It really is. Let's get a little bit back to how experienced we are in JRPGs. Like, for example, you said your first Final Fantasy was Final Fantasy II, or respectively 4, and it's telltale that my first Final Fantasy was actually Final Fantasy Mystic Quest.
Okay.
So that's like probably the level of experience. So I personally, the only Final Fantasy games that I played and finished were Final Fantasy 6 and 7. The other experience that I have with Final Fantasy is that I can play Return to Zanarkand from Final Fantasy X on the piano, and that was it. I never played 10. But yeah, and from this standpoint, looking at Vagrant Story, that, as you already described, it is not exactly turn-based. It has a real-time component, but it's also pausable, and it adds these rhythm elements to it, and we're going to explain that in a little bit more detail in a bit. But behind this all is, in my opinion, a very complex and opaque system of stats, magic, buffs, debuffs, spells, attack strategies, and then there's also an extra layer of a looting game that's somewhat close to Diablo, meaning you can collect a lot of weapons and armor, and then there's another extra layer on top of that, is that you can take all this armor and use it in a smithy, in a blacksmith.
Reforged to have different attributes, get stronger, or it might, suddenly be stronger against this type of element, but it becomes weaker against this type. And I think the crucial part about all these systems you're describing is that the game does not really explain them to you. It gives you kind of like brief introductions for the affinity system and the status system and forging and everything, but it really leaves it up to you to kind of figure out, combining this with this does this, or what does having this status effect on my armor or weapon do. Like, it is very opaque and requires a great deal of experimentation on the player's part, which, can certainly be frustrating. And if you want to approach this game where it's like, oh, I think I need to like have a walkthrough to get through this, that's kind of okay, because it can be a very, very very opaque game otherwise. Like, I think, we have modern parallels in, like, Dark Souls, I think, is a very easily invoked example of a game that has opaque systems that the player kind of has to learn for themselves.
We got to put $1 in the Dark Souls mentions jar,
that's
though.
right.
Yeah.
I've committed the game design sin, which is bringing up Dark Souls to make a comparison. But, that was another game where, it had these RPG mechanics, but it didn't really explain that much to you. You kind of had to figure it out on your own or look it up on a wiki.
Fail upwards.
Exactly. And that is very much harking backwards to the kind of games, these classic PlayStation, Super Nintendo era games that were just opaque, and you just kind of had to, bang your head against them until you could figure them out.
Yeah, kind of the exact opposite of Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, which is like which is known for those who don't know this. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest was an attempt from Squaresoft at the time to approach Western markets with the Final Fantasy series, and they released basically the most dumbed down JRPG possible. Like, you can almost literally play the entire game by just pressing A in combat encounters because it's just so dumbed down. And Vagrant Story is pretty much the opposite.
So that's a critical thing, is that every enemy in the game has a certain kind of affinity, and your attacks will either
that.
Right, and your attacks will either be strong or weak against them based on their affinity and the affinity of your weapon, or their attacks will be strong or weak against you based on the affinity of them and your armor.
And that's the thing. Like, when I played through this, I approached it kind of with a modern mindset, because even though when modern games have a strong challenge, they usually tend to still pull you along, that you never reach a dead end. But that kind of happened to me with Vagrant Story, that like after 8-9 hours or so, that I found myself not having understood the mechanics behind the smithing and the leveling and the looting well enough to beat a boss that came up, and I was basically not capable of defeating it anymore because I didn't have any means to become good enough. And that was a point where I almost quit. I remember that we actually talked at that point in time where I was a little bit frustrated, and you said, like, dude, no, just, grind your teeth, get through it, it's worth it. And I did, and I didn't regret it, because it got me to the point where after a lot of friction, I came to that point where it felt like not I had mastered it, but it had finally clicked. And that's when the game really starts to be fun, because it really expects from you. Let me give an example. In most RPGs, you usually have like your optimal set of armor and weapons and spells that you have equipped, and that's like you can get through the game with it, and if you find something better, you replace it. That's not how you play Vagrant Story. In Vagrant Story, you see the enemy and you analyze the enemy, and you re-equip yourself with a different weapon type, with a different armor type, with different spells, with different combos to optimize your character for this very encounter. And you constantly shift and change your loadout in order to overcome these encounters. It reminded me personally a little bit about what I liked about The Witcher 3, because Witcher 3 made it a lot about gathering information about the monster you were hunting, preparing yourself, and going in with preparation, basically. And it kind of reminded me a little bit of that.
Yeah, it's a very active game. I think you kind of hit on something earlier about Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, and this is something that people rightly criticize JRPGs for, which is that, you're kind of just pressing X, or pressing square or whatever, just to get through the dialogue or like hit attack over and over again to beat these enemies. And it doesn't take a lot of engagement or planning or strategy. You can kind of just brute force your way through, maybe use an item every now and then. And, a lot of RPGs, like, that's a pretty valid criticism, because their strength is not necessarily in having engaging combat. It's in the world, it's in the characters, it's in the over-the-top plot. But I think Vagrant Story is kind of that rare example of an RPG where like the mechanics matter very much, and you have to pay close attention to them, and you have to be engaged with them. They're as integral to the experience of the game. Your understanding and use of the mechanics, that's as integral to the game as the plot or the characters or anything else, really.
It is. So, but it has another strong suit, which is, in my opinion, the plot. Vagrant Story, to me, has both a very interesting art style through which it tells a very unique story that at least I haven't seen like this in any other game so far.
Yes, and that is what is almost what is so remarkable about revisiting this game and replaying it, was that how good the character models and their facial animations are, even for being a PlayStation era games. You know, like especially like if you remember, like by comparison, the first Metal Gear Solid game, which is also considered like a very advanced games, those characters' faces looked like a mashed up plate of potatoes. You know, like they don't look like faces. But these games, the art style is so strong and the character designs are so strong, they actually have expressive faces. The facial animations change and they look, you know, it's very stylized and very kind of anime looking, but they look, you know, convincing, and it draws you into the plot and it draws you into the world.
They totally do. And one thing that a lot of people have said to me is that what they still remember strongly from Vagrant Story is, for example, the cover and the cover art and all the hand-drawn art around it, because it is certainly an anime-ish style, but it has a very unique and own flavor to it. Like, it feels very hand-drawn. You can see the hand of the artist in the imagery. And what they managed to do is, like, they brought this hand-drawn style somehow into the more realistic looking PS1 era graphic style, which shouldn't work on paper, but it does. Like, it translates very well from these hand-drawn beautiful characters to 3D characters that have the exact same aesthetic.
It does kind of have the feel almost like of a comic book or a graphic novel brought to life. And a lot of that is the result of this team under the direction of Yasumi Matsuno, who is a director, game designer at Squaresoft. And he kind of, with Vagrant Story, he kind of created this alternate universe. Like, he and this team of artists have created this kind of like artistically coherent universe that's kind of separate from Final Fantasy. And like, as you said, it has this very distinct art style that has kind of carried through to other titles that Matsuno has directed, like Final Fantasy Tactics and even Final Fantasy 12.
And also, what I looked up, I never played it. It was still, for a long time on my list, is Tactics Ogre, which came out for the Super Nintendo and also later the PS1, as far as I know. And that also has a very, very similar graphic style that sort of feels like it's almost his handwriting, Matsuno's handwriting in a way. It's very distinctive, and it's something that is very striking at first glance. And one thing that struck me a lot is how skilled the programmers and artists were at using the very restrictive hardware of the PS1 to show exactly what is necessary to convey the most atmosphere and the most, you know, as you said, the characters look great, the scenes, they're well lit, especially for a PS1 era game.
Even the audio is very crisp, it's well mastered, it does kind of have like a lot of echo and reverb, but it's all in service of creating this sense of being like, ooh, I'm in this big, spooky, spacious place. Like, everything about it is just a very, very well produced package.
And I believe you already said it's not like the big AAA game, but it's because the designers and programmers, they knew what to leave out. Because, for example, there is no voiceover, right? Everything, and we already talked about that. It has this kind of, I'm sorry, hiccups as always. We have this kind of comic-ish style, the dialogues being conveyed in speech bubbles, like in comics. Like, you almost have an interactive comic scene. You don't hear any voices talk, but it works. After a while, you don't even think about it anymore. They're still expressive through the great animations and acting, and also through a very striking character design. There are a handful of characters, not that many, like 8-9 different characters, but all of them are memorable, all of them are interesting and striking, and they have a very strong and unique design, and that's beautiful to look at.
And I think that's a credit to this team that Matsuno was kind of able to assemble for these games, and how many of them stuck with him and kind of helped create all these games that came after. And that's this alternate universe that's kind of been created in the Squaresoft mythology is like known as Ivalice, and it wasn't considered, Vagrant Story wasn't considered a part of this world when it was made, but there are all sorts of like hints and symbols and even like a character or two who would go on to appear in Final Fantasy Tactics or in Final Fantasy 12, and it kind of Vagrant Story was definitely kind of like retconned into becoming the shared universe. And what I always found so fascinating about it is that in exactly the way that the mainline Final Fantasy games are like big and bombastic, they're all about epic quests to save the world and gods and demons and mythology. This alternate universe of Ivalice is not that. You get a little bit of that. There's magic and dragons and all that good stuff, but it's much more about politics and the machinations of people scheming against other people, and morally gray stories where there aren't really clear good guys and clear bad guys, and even the supposed bad guys have a good motivation for doing what they want to do. It's really this kind of almost, I want to like use darker, more mature take on these fantasy elements, and it's really something special, and I think that's why these games have amassed such a cult following.
Cult following fits it very well, yeah. We already said that the game mechanics themselves are very opaque. And in the same way, I feel the storytelling itself is also very opaque. I mean, we could go a little bit into, like, we don't want to summarize the entire plot because I believe that will be boring and also spoilery, because the story itself has a lot of twists and turns. Characters that seem bad might turn around and turn around again. Motivations shift and change. And I feel like discovering what's really happening and who wants to do what is part of the game itself. So I wouldn't want to take away much of it, but we could definitely give a little bit of a gist to see what kind of we're expecting here, basically.
Yeah,
right?
Speaking broad strokes, I think you're absolutely right. The story is one of, if not the strongest parts of the game.
Yes.
So we should be as spoiler light as possible.
I mean, so basically, the interesting part about it is that the game already opens in medias res. It throws you right into a situation of a lot of intrigue, Machiavellianism, backstabbery, and you don't even know the factions that are involved. So it starts in the mansion of Duke Bardoba, who is a key political figure in the continent of Valendia. And this mansion, this estate, is being attacked by a religious cult called Millenkamp. And that is led by a very charismatic and intriguing leader named Sidney Lossatrot. And apparently, this is what we're led to believe, Sidney is out to steal a, let's call it artifact at this point, named the Blood Sin. And the Blood Sin is something that is enabling someone who travels to the ancient city of Leá Monde to harvest an ancient dark power, which so far this Duke Bardoba somehow profits from. And apparently that is Sidney, who is portrayed as the villain of the piece. Sidney's motivation to harness this power to, seize power over the continent of Valendia.
Sidney, who looks like a quintessential anime villain.
Absolutely,
with bare torso, flowing, spiky blonde hair, and just arms. The only part of him that's armored is just his arms, which are like sleeved in metal.
And also very androgynous character.
Yes.
Like he has this boyish look, very long blonde hair, and interestingly enough, the two main characters of the game are male but have strikingly female names, because he's called Sidney. Is it a unisex name? I'm not sure actually.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Sidney, Sidney could be a female name.
Okay. I mean, yes, Sidney, but is it also a male name? That was
A male can be Sidney too. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Because the main protagonist who we play is called Ashley, which is also a more common female name, I think. Or is it also a unisex name?
It is technically unisex. I think that's more of an old thing. I think it's very uncommon now for dudes to be named Ashley, but back in the day, yeah.
So it's definitely an interesting choice because both are a very typically androgynous anime type character. I would say. Sydney probably even a little bit more, but also very striking and interesting characters. And your protagonist, Ashley, is a so-called risk breaker, sent by the Valendia Knights of the Peace, which is an organization of the government, of highly trained and specialized operatives for government tasked with plausible deniability. So you basically are a black op.
It always struck me that, like, you know, this was the Final Fantasy equivalent. He is Solid Snake, you know, his whole mission being like dispatched by this government black organization to, you know, go undercover and try to figure out these political machinations. Like he is Final Fantasy Solid Snake.
Whoa. I never thought of it, but it makes total sense. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and this I always kind of had a pet theory that like there was some influence there, because this was 2 years after Metal Gear Solid came out. You know, Metal Gear Solid came out in '98, and this game came out in 2000. Like I have to imagine, and this was also a game that was like much more. I think where Square's traditional offerings are kind of like much more pointed towards the Japanese or Eastern audience. Like I remember there was a fair bit of advertisement for Vagrant Story in the West. This was, I think, with the whole designs and the marketing and everything, like this was kind of aimed at a much broader audience. So yeah, I wonder if those things are related sometimes.
Like now that you say it, like there's also a very similar style of storytelling. Like it looks typically early era 3D PlayStation 1 especially. Like they have a very similar visual aesthetic in many ways, even though they portray completely different time settings and whatever. But also the way is being controlled, and different scenes are being lit and shot.
Yes.
Now that you say it,
and that is another aspect of charm to this game, is that the presentation is very, very cinematic.
Yes.
You know, it's not just slick and well polished. It's that, like, with the way the cameras are set and the cutscenes and the dramatic movement as characters talk back and forth to each other. Like, this is a game that's very much taking the baton from the Metal Gear Solid games, being like, games can be a serious cinematic medium to tell these like high octane stories, and Vagrant Story is an excellent early example of that.
Absolutely. So let's get back to the plot. Apparently, Sydney is trying to steal this blood sin, and then he escapes Ashley, which is played by you, to travel to the city of Leá Monde to apparently harness this power there. So you follow and pursue him and have to infiltrate the city.
Right. And so Leá Monde is this kind of like abandoned, semi-abandoned, you know, this imposing stonework. It's like a dungeon almost, you know, because it's you're shown like an exterior shot of it in the beginning, but then as soon as you go in, you're pretty much in. It's a dungeon crawler, you know. You're descending deeper and deeper into the heart of this dark city, and as you progress down, you know, you discover that like, oh, there's some sort of sinister magic at work, you know, like there's some magical reason why all of these different political actors have converged on this place now, and why Sydney has come here in the first place. And more, you know, and this is, you start out initially, you know, like, oh, I'm fighting regular soldiers, but then very quickly, oh, a soldier comes back to life and he's a zombie, and these monsters start emerging, and it takes on much more kind of sinister and occult undertones, and you really descend into this very like kind of dark fantasy epic. But I think the key thing is that you're throughout this plot, you're kind of given the impression that Ashley Riot is just kind of a bit player, you know, like you are not the brave, dashing hero at the center of all the action. You just kind of, you're kind of a bit player, a small fry who stumbles into this much, much larger conspiracy.
And Ashley, yeah, I totally agree with that. Like, he feels not like he is in charge of what happens, but he's definitely a key figure. So you almost feel like a pawn on the chessboard that's being moved around by different characters, because you definitely have a vital role in the whole plot. But you don't actively participate in the story, even game mechanic wise, which is something that, like, this is basically my main criticism of the game. Like, it's not that it makes the game bad, but I'm kind of sad that you never directly interact with the story. Like, for example, the reason you're underground in the beginning, for example, is that Leá Monde is an island city. And at this point, like, Leá Monde used to be like this sprawling, flourishing city that was shaken by earthquakes and is now kind of in ruins. And there are also like vortices around in the sea around it, so it's impossible to reach it by sea or air, so you have to travel through like the ancient wine cellar caves underground to reach the city. So you
Right.
spend a lot of time underground, and that's often not really where the main storyline happens, with all the characters that also travel to Leá Monde and are, backstabbing each other and
And not only that, there are not even any NPCs. That's how non-traditional an RPG this is that there aren't even any NPCs in that you encounter. You see other people in cutscenes, but you don't go to town, you don't sleep at the inn, go to the blacksmith. Like, it's just you, and you might arrive at a workbench where you can craft new weapons and armor and stuff. But other than that, it's just you diving deeper and deeper into this dungeon. It almost, and this struck me when I was replaying this, it almost reminded me like one of the old school kind of like Ultima Underworld, or just one of these games that it's just, it's like, I'm starting at the top of the labyrinth and I have to work my way down to the bottom and slay the dragon. Like, it had like a very kind of old school flavor to it almost. I couldn't quite put my finger on it.
Like Matsuno said in an interview, like, this game combines strategy, tactics, role-playing, action, and he said, at its worst, this game contains all these elements. At its best, this game is a completely new thing that incorporates elements of all these. And I think that's a good assessment.
It really, yeah, I'm, not to be too hyperbolic about it, but I think you can see Vagrant Story's DNA in a lot of games that came after it, like a lot of these games that now blend action and RPG. I think, again, to make the obvious example, I'm going to have to put another dollar in the jar, but like, I don't think you get to Dark Souls without Vagrant Story. I mean, I think Vagrant Story kind of laid this template for having deep, meaningful RPG mechanics, that the player kind of has to engage with and has to kind of give a shit about. Sorry, pardon me, has to give a damn about. And, we can swear. Really participate in. Yeah, that's true. I don't know what I was. I don't even know where that sense of propriety came from. That's not like me.
I know.
Yeah. Anyway, this idea that Vagrant Story really kind of, I think, pioneered this genre of like dark third-person action games.
You know what? Because you're so right. Because in order to finish Vagrant Story, to get through it, you have to get good. There's no other way around.
Indeed. Indeed you do.
So we start out, we have this scene at the mansion, and then the actual real story. Let's like the pre-phase where you get a little bit of tutorial, and then you go underground, travel to Leá Monde. So you're gonna get a lot of combat encounters. And how does a combat encounter work? Like we talked about a lot of granular things without actually really describing what happens. Like how do I control this?
So there's no battle screen. It does not fade into anything and send you to some other screen. It happens right there as you're playing, and then you hit a button to kind of go into fighting mode, action mode, and a 3D sphere will appear around your character, and that's how far you can reach and how far you can attack. And if an enemy is in your sphere, then you can choose from a variety of actions. Do I want to just attack and hit him with my weapon? Do I want to try to cast a spell? And then if you attack, you can also sub-target your enemy's limbs. You can go for their head, their arm.
I always loved that.
And it has real effects. Certain enemies might take more damage if you hit them in certain places, or if you hit an enemy's arm, they might not be able to use their shield, and then you'll be able to do more damage to them. There really are all these kind of like tactical, strategic layers that are baked into.
If you hit a magician's head enough, like every body part actually has its own set of HP. Like every enemy has a total set of HP, but every body part has its own. So if you have a magician and you hit him on the head enough, he can't do any spells anymore because he's really just flabbergasted by your bludgeoning. That's also an interesting strategic layer. Or if you hit the legs enough, they start getting slower and lose agility.
Yeah, it's and this is again like there were no contemporaries to what Vagrant Story really did with that. Like it kind of fused, real time and turn based in a really interesting way. And then, as you attack, what we mentioned earlier, the rhythm aspect comes into it. And in order to be really effective in combat, you don't just do these inputs. You also have to time your button presses in a certain way so as to rack up, you get multiple hits in a single action and you deal more damage as you build the chain. But then of course, there's also this mechanic that we haven't even mentioned yet that adds this whole other wonderful gambling luck of the draw element to the game, which is risk.
Oh, yes.
And the more actions you take, the more you build up your chain, maybe the more spells you cast, you build up this stat called risk. And the higher that gets, the more damage you take, or the easier it is for you to become inflicted with status ailments.
The less likely it is for you to hit something, but mostly,
Yes.
because
Yeah.
with every action, it tells you a percentage of likability to hit the target with that action. And if your risk is really high, that drops very low. Let me just really briefly, because this is something where I said, like, the mechanics are very opaque in the beginning, and they keep being like that until you really get it. Let me just try to explain how this chaining works, because I think this is really a central aspect of what makes the combat so special. So, as Michael already explained, there's this sphere around you when you pause, and if an enemy is within that sphere, you can attack it. And what you can do is, to 3 of the buttons of your PlayStation controller, you can assign different chain attacks. They have different effects. For example, there are chain attacks that say, if you land that, the next attack will have a bonus of 100%. Or if you land this attack, the next attack will repair your weapon a little bit. Or the next attack will refill your mana a little bit. Like, you really have to think about which effects you use against which enemy. Is it an enemy that uses a lot of mana? So you assign an action that refills your mana during this encounter. And as soon as you start hitting, there is this moment where we briefly see an exclamation mark above the head of Ashley. And this is the exact moment you have to press the chain action.
Yes.
And this is when it starts feeling like a Guitar Hero game, because it doesn't even show you a preface. You really have to know the timings of all the attacks. You have to learn them. And then in the end, it feels like you can chain up to 15 attacks. And then, you're in this chain attack where it's like bam, bam, one after the other. And you, of course, can increase the efficacy of your attacks drastically with that. And I kind of wanted to explain this because it took me a while to get behind it myself when I played it, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think especially if you approach it from the mentality that we usually approach with RPGs, it's that, like, there's not really such a thing in most RPGs as like, oh, I've got to time my button presses a certain way. I mean, I think, and then again, I'm going to say the D word again, but like there is another bit of shared DNA with Dark Souls, right? I think that game really popularized the inclusion of these like timing mechanics in games. And I think, Vagrant Story is just that in kind of its like purest form. Like it really, in order to be good at the game, you kind of have to learn to get your head around this little timing mini game. And I can see that being a turnoff for a lot of people, but I think it's just one more example of the way the game has these mechanics that, it demands that you be involved with it. It's not going to let you be casual and just kind of like sit back and you're not just pressing X to attack over and over again. Like it really demands that you be an active participant. I think that's what makes it so great for so many people.
And that is an aspect that makes action RPGs in a way more interesting than merely turn-based RPGs, because it adds a layer of skill to it, because you say, okay, you don't only strategically plan, but you also have to bring a little bit of reflexes and skill to it. And this is always the question, like, because you never are going to replicate real combat in a video game, but you also have to find an abstract approximation on skills that are also needed in real combat. So anyone who ever did martial arts knows that sometimes it can feel a little bit like dancing, because you have to have rhythm, you have timing, you have reflexes. And so I thought this mechanic of emulating, I mean, at the time, DDR games, I think, did they exist at that time? Probably in arcades, right?
In 2000, yeah, they were. I feel like they were kind of at their height from like the early 2000s through to like maybe
Probably,
05, 06.
And I felt like it's such a logical step to emulate dance simulations in a game, to emulate fighting.
I like that.
Because it's kind of close. Just like Kung Fu is fighting and Tai Chi is considered to be a dance, but actually Tai Chi was a very slow form of Kung Fu when the monks weren't allowed to train Kung Fu. So there's so much, I don't know. And it also fits the whole theme of the game. Like, there are so many different historical influences in the setting that Vagrant Story brings to the table. Like, you can see influences in French Renaissance, you can see influences from sword and sandal movies,
There's Mediterranean
Yes.
themes in there, tiling, and yeah.
And the Knights, like the group that Ashley belongs to, the VKP, the Valendia Knights of the Peace, they consist of Knights, Templars, Inquisitors, so you have this theme of Crusaders,
Yeah.
because some of the enemies have like these great helms that were prevalent during the Crusader times. And there's so much aesthetic mixed together that shouldn't work, but it's so homogenous, and it feels so, I don't know, it feels like its own thing, but it's also relatable. It doesn't feel completely foreign. There are a lot of elements that feel both familiar and fresh at the same time.
It feels like a whole and complete world.
Yes.
It feels like, there are some games where you can pick them up and play them, and you just it has that it factor, which is where that there's like enough flavor and character to it where it feels that it is a whole and complete world that has like a backstory and characters you want to be interested in and learn what they're about, and there's stories to everything. Like, this game is very good at evoking that feel. And that's, I think that's really the lifeblood of RPGs. That's the best RPGs live and die by that.
True, yeah. Well, so when you replayed it now, what was your experience to replaying it? How much did you remember from back in the day? And so how did you approach it? I would be actually pretty interested in that.
Yeah, when I played it originally, I was I want to say 15,
Okay.
15, 16. So just old enough to be having a lot of free time on my hands. Not quite old enough to be getting into too much trouble just yet. And, but still to have a lot of free time on my hands and, to play video games. And so I got really into this game. A friend loaned it to me because he was raving about it. And this was another friend who also loved, Final Fantasy games and whatnot.
Okay.
And so he played this and loved it and then gave it to me and said, all right, you got to give this a shot. And yeah, this game took me, God, 2.5, 3 months to beat, all told, putting in solid shifts because, at first, the very first time I played it, it was just constantly banging my head against the wall, as you said, not understanding the mechanics. Like, I remembered having a really bad time with this game the very first time I played it. And I was like video game literate at that point, like I'd been playing video games since the NES, SNES days. So it wasn't a question of like not loving the medium sufficiently, but I just didn't really get the game. And then, I distinctly remember, loading up the modem. We didn't quite have high-speed internet at the time, just loading up that dial-up modem in 2001, 2002. Yeah, logging on to the fan site. And this was one of those like GeoCities ass fan sites with just basic HTML and the fancy animated stuff at the top.
Animated GIFs.
The little... Yeah, the counter at the bottom. I gotta look up. I want to say it was like the Vagrant Story Haven or the Vagrant Haven or something like that. I'm gonna look it up afterwards, and if it's still there, there'll be a link in the description. Anyway, cool. I read this fan site because the game doesn't do a very good job of teaching its mechanics to you. And once I read the fan site, and it was like, oh, okay, that's what this, and this does. I just needed that little nudge, like I was hungry for that info, and I just needed that little nudge. And then I figured the game out, and then I remembered. Then I beat it in like 2-3 weeks because I was finally able to just like start really plow through it and making progress and understanding the mechanics of the game. And so it was a very like love-hate relationship at first. And so coming back to the game, like I was for a minute, I had to look up a lot of the mechanics again. Like I remembered that I needed to care about that stuff, but I didn't know the combinations of stuff to forge or what certain affinities meant. So I had to do a little refresher. But once I had done that, 10-15 minutes of reading, it was like, all right, I'm ready to tackle this again. So I guess that's the big takeaway from this, That is like, if you, dear listener, want to play this game, please do, because it's excellent. But also don't feel bad if you gotta like read a wiki to understand the mechanics, because it's a pretty dense game.
And what you just described reminded me of we recorded another podcast, which will probably released after this one. I don't really know exactly how we're going to schedule this, but pretty likely. But we recorded another podcast, which was about older adventure games. And we talked about the same thing, that you start these games early without really knowing what it's about. And then you play them again, like, I don't know, 20 years later or 15 years later. You forgot about all the granular stuff, but you still remember how to approach it.
Yes.
So that gives you kind of the key of how to play it, so you don't have to figure that out anymore. But still, all the challenge and all the discovery is back. So that's maybe even the best way to experience it. But I completely agree with Michael there. So my experience was a little bit different. As I said, my exposure to Japanese RPGs was less, but at the time, I remember I didn't even have a PlayStation 1 at that time, and a friend of mine had this game, and I was over at his place a lot, and I would sometimes take over and play it, so I played it a little bit, but mostly I would just watch him, and we would play through it together, but he was usually the one playing it. So that was my memory of the game. So when I booted it up now, it was a completely different experience, because there was no muscle memory left, and a lot of stuff was gone. So I basically played it for the first time while knowing it. And yeah, as I said, like, I once ran into a point where I was about to quit it, because it basically expected from me to, if you want to beat this boss that you're stuck at, you have to go back about 2-3 hours and play all of these parts again to come back with better equipment, with a more refined leveling strategy, and to have, more variety in combat tactics and equipment that is tailored to different kinds of enemies. But then I did that, and it was very, very satisfying, because that was also exactly the point where I really got it, where it clicked in my head. And then I really started feeling like a risk breaker. Haha. That was kind of, for me, the experience. Like, I got it now.
You know what I will say? I want to say this real quick, is that revisiting this game, this thought just occurred to me, that I think a lot of times the vision of a game in our head is often way better than it actually is when you go to replay it. Like, and, I just got my Super Nintendo. I just went back north to see my family, and I brought my old Super Nintendo back down with me. And I've been having a blast replaying some of these games. But at the same time, you're struck by, like, the vision in my head of these games was always so much grander.
Glasses.
Yeah. What I will say about Vagrant Story is that this game exceeded my memory of it.
Yes.
It looked better. It sounded better. It was dramatic, engaging, gripping, fun to play. Like, this is one of those games that is better than I remembered it being, which is probably just about the highest compliment I can give an old video game.
I had the same experience, and I thought it is also because this story is so intricate and political and, Machiavellianist and everything, that with, 15, maybe 12 or something, you were just too young to get this in the way it is supposed to be, because you said, like, it's more this a little bit more mature setting, and there's a lot of nuance to the story, and I think with a little bit more, age and maturity, you're probably better off at understanding the finesse behind it.
I think so too.
You know what we forgot? Which is probably the most forgettable aspect of the game.
What's that?
It's such a typical turn of the millennium 3D early 3D game trope, and that is box puzzles.
Ooh, oh man.
What is it with games of that era? Every game thinks it's such a genius idea to include puzzles in which you have to push and pull and stack,
jump on,
and carry boxes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh man.
Because I think that's kind of the most forgettable aspect of Vagrant Story, but it is, in the same way, it also fits the style of the game very well, because the whole level architecture feels like it is assembled of different 3D cubes. Like, there are different textures and sometimes different shapes, but it feels like, it feels almost like a Lego set of level design.
Yeah.
So, and then it makes total sense that you have like, let's add in a couple of puzzles with cubes, because cubes are easy to be rendered. It's just, 8 surfaces. No, wait, 1, 2, 3, 6 surfaces.
Six.
Damn, 6 surfaces. So it's not a lot to render, but you can also, a little bit of a lateral thinking challenge in between to have a little bit of difference in kind, so that it's not just cutscenes and fighting. So yeah, these puzzles are not bad, but I always felt like we just talked about that in the Resident Evil podcast, where it's like, who builds this shit? Why is that here? Why are there suddenly cubes that you have to stack to get ahead? So it's kind of like, it's the most gamey part.
The box puzzles are so forgettable that I just replayed the game and I had forgotten about them. I didn't even think to bring them up in this episode. Like, that is how forgettable they are. So yeah, I think it is interesting to me. I hadn't even considered that, how the box just became this presence in, once games made the switch to 3D, I guess it's like, here's a 3D object that, we can easily construct because it's a minimal number of polygons. And it's like, well, how many puzzles can we have with boxes? All right, we're gonna have like box stacking and box pushing and sorting and jumping and everything. Like, it is that is so fascinating. Has there ever been like a documentary or a good video essay on like the history of the box in video games? Because it's totally a product of its time. You switch to 3D and it's like, what's a simple 3D shape we can throw in there? All right, boxes. That's not too taxing on the resources. Let's just put a bunch of those things in there. And then everything kind of flows from there.
I remember the reason why I even noticed this. The episode of Forgotten Gems before Vagrant Story was about Soul Reaver. And basically, Soul Reaver has the exact same puzzles.
Yes.
You have puzzles in which you have like giant cubes, and you have to... You can push them, you can pull them, and you can pull them upward to stack them. That's basically it. And then between this, I tried another game of that era. I might just talk about it. It was Shadow Man, which was also from that era. And in Shadow Man, you also have these kind of box puzzles, And then I started thinking about it, and I realized there are so many games, even classic point-and-click adventure games, suddenly thought that it's a good idea to add box puzzles. The Broken Sword series, right? Game 1 and 2 were 2D, and with Game 3, which also came out at the same time, they shifted to a 3D graphic, which was, it was okay. And then they got this idea, man, like cubes, they're like boxes, they're 3D objects. Let's add a lot of
boxes can be puzzles too, yeah.
And the 50% of the game consisted of boring box puzzles.
Hey,
and
let's drop some knowledge on the audience right now about a blast from the past game, which is goddamn Ocarina of Time is 25% box puzzles. It's fully a quarter puzzles of pushing boxes around. Like, it was inescapable at the time.
And it's so interesting to me to play Vagrant Story, which is, an action RPG, is kind of the last game where you would expect box puzzles to be in there. And I mean, as I said, like, the box puzzles in and of themselves, they're not bad puzzles, but they just feel disjointed. They don't feel like they belong in there. Like, you have this grand story of intrigue and taking over the power of this whole continent through magic and everything. But in between, you got to move a little.
It's like padding. It's padding, right? Because Vagrant Story by itself is not a super long game. Like, if you don't know what you're doing, it can take a long time to complete the game. But, if...
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, me too, the first time I played it. Holy God, I don't want to think about how many hours were on the counter there. But, if you have a good idea of what you're doing, it really only takes 20, 25, maybe 30 hours tops to beat the game.
I remember that you told me that before I started
you
playing
were just
Vagrant
like,
Story.
No way.
And you said, oh, the good thing about Vagrant Story is, Ragnar, it's super because it's also not so long. It's only like 25, 30 hours. And I was like... Oh.
Yeah, that's
okay.
and that's we're talking in Japanese RPG scale here. So that's the thing you got to understand, is that it is, these games are like huge time. They do demand of your time. Mm-hmm. But I think
that's true.
But so I think that, and that's the thing though, is that like that's the dance of the Japanese RPG, is that like you invest a lot of time in it for whatever reason, and that like you form an attachment to the game, and you kind of want to see it through. And I think Vagrant Story is a game that like gives you these mechanics that engage you and keep you coming back to the game for dozens of hours, but it's also like respectful of your time. You know, it's not a huge time sink. There's not endless amounts of content and stuff to do. There's just kind of this story that you're going to kind of progress through and get to the end of, and then that's it, you know?
Yeah.
And there is something, you know, at a time when these Japanese RPGs were huge prospects, you know, even games like the Final Fantasy series, 7, 8, and 9, all of those games, I think minimum 40, 50 hours just to not even doing the extra content, just 40, 50 hours, just the story. It demands a lot of your time. And so I think Vagrant Story is almost, it brings that, you know, not AAA, but AA approach to Japanese RPG design. It is that format. It is all of those great elements, but kind of stripped down and refined and just in this very kind of like sleek, consistent, complete package.
Yeah, that's really true. And I mean, something I've been thinking about a lot lately is how still the argument of a game being not so like not long enough is considered criticism.
Right.
But at the point in my life, I actually often consider somebody saying, oh, this game was only 6 hours long. I often consider this to be good for me because I really don't have that much time to play super long games anymore. And it speaks a lot for Vagrant Story because it took me a lot of time. I spent my good 25, 30 hours with it, as you said. But still, it kept me going. And, you know, I'm also easily distracted. And it really speaks for the game that I wanted to continue and that at some point, like, it was past the point where I understood the game, where it started to be fun and where I understood what the game wanted from me, that I wanted to get back and experience that again because it feels good once you learn, you know, once you learn the rhythm, once you learn everything that you need to be good in these combat encounters, they start becoming really fun and addicting in a way, in a good way, though, not in a cheap Skinner box type addiction, but it's more like this, I want to get back into this. This is fun. This is great. Feels good, you know? And I think it really speaks for the game that it keeps someone like me playing through it because it doesn't happen that often anymore these days. You know, it's different than before. Than, you know, when I was like 12, 30 and you would finish every game 15 times until you knew everything. And now that's not so much the case anymore.
I think, it's that interesting approach that it's kind of like it's like, cause it's even like in the story itself, like this is not some epic sweeping save the world tale, but it's just more about kind of like the machinations of these political players. And then you do get like dark eldritch forces at work, you know, there is a little bit of that. But generally, I think the main thing carrying you through is a very small, focused, and personal story. And I think, you know, in a time like then as now, you know, the tendency was towards big epic bloat in RPGs, and that's, you know, Final Fantasy VII definitely was big and epic. 8 and 9 were like big and epic. That's kind of that series' trademark, and I think people have kind of associated the Japanese RPG always kind of strives for that kind of like epic grandeur, even if the budget is never like and the presentation is never like quite there to match. They always kind of strive for that. But Vagrant Story very much didn't. You know, Vagrant Story it knew what it wanted to be. And it delivered on that. And that's, you know, it's those are the best video games, the one that have a strong sense of self like that.
Just a question out of curiosity, because Final Fantasy XII, could it also be considered one of these grand epics because it's, you know, made by the same guy and apparently in the same universe?
It is, but even Final Fantasy XII is telling kind of like a more small, focused, and political story. Like, it does kind of get into like there are crystals and like big epic forces at work, but that's not really what I actually just replayed this. They re-released it on PlayStation, and I just replayed this game recently. And it's not really about like big epic battles and stuff. It's about a small kind of ragtag crew of scrappy freedom fighters who end up, you know, going at odds with this big evil empire. It's a lot of comparisons to Star Wars are made, and, you know, they're not untrue. It is a very similar plot. But yeah, the story is even the story of that game, which is like a mainline Final Fantasy game, which also takes place in this Ivalice universe, the same universe as Vagrant Story. Like, even that
apparently it is set on the same continent, even.
Yeah, something like that.
Valendia,
same world, same continent. Yeah. And so, and again, shares a director too, or at least initially, Matsuno was the initial director of Final Fantasy XII before he had to step down for the project, same as he was the director of Vagrant Story. And it brought that sensibility to the game, which is that, we're telling a small, focused story about characters and political machinations and intrigue. Like, even Final Fantasy XII is definitely the most that of any of the Final Fantasy games, and it shows. And that is, I think, again, what another thing that is so special about this world is that it has kind of this different take on storytelling and how it uses these fantasy tropes and elements.
I mean, I think that Final Fantasy games in general are also known for often telling, I mean, of course, grand epic tales, but often being very personal stories, and also often having these very deep and philosophical notions. And I think that's something Vagrant Story is strong at. To go just a little bit into detail, is your main character, Ashley, more and more parts of his past over time, and also realizes that his memories might not be exactly correct. And that is actually also tied into how he improves his abilities, because over time the game tells you, oh, Ashley just remembered an ability. And that means, okay, you can choose a new combat combo, for example, right? It's tied.
Or you have a new spell or something like that. Yeah.
I think the chain mechanics are tied to that, but I'm not 100% sure. And this is also a very interesting origin story, because like it goes a little bit into the idea of what memories actually are. Like it asks questions like, is it better to remember something good or to remember something that is true, if it may be even bad for you? Like it goes into these almost existential notions a little bit, to ask like, are you even sure that anything you remember you can trust, because it's biased and all that kind of stuff. And it has some moments that really made me think, and I feel like this is also necessary for this type of game, because people kind of expect it from them to have a little bit of introspective depth.
The pontificating and rumination on human nature and human consciousness, and the legitimacy of authority, and the way that in these games you're often rebelling against some sort of illegitimate authority. That is like a JRPG trope, and in this case it's, you have this deranged religious cult, and also these dark magics that are rising up, and that kind of also spreads throughout other JRPGs. That trope was always interesting to me. The way even the character like Ashley Riot, with a last name like Riot, it implies some sort of like kinetic, almost like punk energy. Like he is not an inactive character. Like he's out there, dynamic, and he's like acting. He kind of like forces his way to the center of these like really grand conspiracy.
I mean, we could go really granular, but I think if we started to do that, it would get tedious, and it would take away from discovering it on your own. At this point, I was thinking while we were doing this episode, like this is our 5th or 6th podcast, and so far we always kind of want to end up on this question, like, did it hold up? But I always feel like these episodes are almost entirely us gushing about a game.
Do we need to play a bad game? Is that what we should be doing? Should we dunk? I could dunk on a game. It could be fun to really like just clown on a bad old piece of software. But it's got to be like a beloved one. That should we the Ocarina of Time takedown? Should we do that? Maybe it's finally time to
commit public suicide on the internet. I mean, on the other hand, I think Egoraptor already did that.
That's true.
He's still alive, so I don't know. What I was suggesting, is that it's almost getting kind of ironic that we're approaching the end of an episode, and then it's so superfluous to ask, hey, did it hold up? Like, sure, it held up. Like, just listen to us, gushing.
Effusive praise, just nonstop.
Yes. No, I gotta really say that we could probably talk for a couple more hours about it, but in the end, we should just, recommend it and say, damn, yes, we had a blast from the past with Vagrant
certified.
Story. It's absolutely blast from the past certified. So for those of you who want to play it, it has been re-released for PS Vita, and PS3 in the PSN store, so you can buy it there.
Sony, port that shit to the PlayStation 4 already.
Yeah.
Stop fucking around here.
It should not be a big deal, right? I mean, they already have the package ready. It's just an emulator.
It's outrageous. It's absolute. This is not the time. I'm turning into the goddamn angry gamer. Like, and another thing about these greedy companies. Like, I can't do that right now. But
What
it
were
really
they
is kind
thinking?
of outrageous.
Maybe it is because they're re-releasing and porting a lot of the Final Fantasy titles, and it goes into this notion that Vagrant Story is those people who remember it really fondly. That's why it doesn't get the attention that maybe like a Final Fantasy VII would get, because everybody knows Final Fantasy VII. Or, I don't know, Chrono Cross, I think that was also ported not too long ago.
Yeah, it's very much in like the same league. There's this kind of like whole realm of mid-tier Square and to a lesser extent Enix RPGs from the 90s and early 2000s that like weren't crushing headlines like your Final Fantasies and your Chrono Triggers.
I mean,
but,
it got
had
critical acclaim. It
It definitely did.
Yeah.
It definitely did. But I don't think it was it wasn't like a million seller. Like I don't think it was until a couple of years afterwards that it was really
it was
like
financially very successful. I actually looked it
was
up
it?
before.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the curious thing about it. Like, it was financially very successful. It was critically not just positively received, but it was acclaimed, like high 90 ratings, over 90 ratings on average.
What I remember, like what got me interested in the game in the first place, is that I remember reading that it got like a perfect score in Famitsu, which was at the time, like before we had the internet where we could just know everything about everything at the drop of a hat. Like Famitsu was kind of it's this mythic Japanese games magazine that is just like the ultimate authority on, good and bad video games, and they have the ultimate writers there, like passing judgment. And so for it to get a perfect score in Famitsu was just, like, oh my God, it's only like 2 other games had ever gotten a perfect score. So I remember reading that and being like, okay, what's the deal with this Vagrant Story game?
That's interesting, right? Because if you think about it, usually a cult classic usually doesn't get the highest ratings when it comes out. Like games like, I don't know, Planescape Torment, for example, come to mind, because they're not perfect games, but then over time they become like these absolute masterpieces that suddenly every game critic knows that it's the best game of all time. But at the time they weren't able to see the brilliance of it. But with Vagrant Story, it's kind of the other way around. Like, it came out and everybody almost unanimously was agreeing that it's an absolutely magnificent and brilliant game, but then it turned out to be just like a low-key cult classic for people who remember it, and it didn't carry over that well. On the other hand, I asked about any game from a lot of viewers, and so many people, like, I got at least 50 times Vagrant Story recommended, so there must still be a lot of love for this game out there. I think
so, deservedly so. And I mean, I think that's as sure a sign as any that there is, still a passionate community around this game of people who really love Vagrant Story. And I think, if you like Japanese RPGs, if you're a fan of Final Fantasy Tactics or Final Fantasy 12, if you're at all interested in even if you like RPGs and you want something a little bit different, like, give it a shot. You will not be disappointed. Yeah, Ragnar, I mean, I guess, we can both agree that Vagrant Story, don't walk to your local PlayStation and download it. It is Blast from the Past certified.
We thank you for listening, and we welcome you next time. And for now, we say, we feel you. All right. You guys have a good day. Thank you for listening, and ta-ta.